Hello, young soul. Welcome to the Daily Horror Channel. If you are afraid of real and scary reports, this channel is not for you. I suggest you leave this video, but if you are not afraid of listening to these horrifying reports, I suggest you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories. Deep in the Antarctic, sealed off by eternal ice and unforgiving cold, lay the Polaris Science Station. Once a vibrant hub of climate research, it had now fallen silent. Its last communication had been weeks ago, mentioning strange phenomena before it abruptly disconnected. Anna, a determined and courageous climate scientist, had been sent to investigate the disappearance of her colleagues and find out what had happened. My name is Anna, and Antarctica has always been my dream destination. The icy, desolate expanse has drawn me since I was young, and I became a climate scientist with the hope of unlocking the secrets of extreme weather. When I was called to investigate the Polaris Science Station, I felt a mix of excitement and apprehension. The station had cut off communication after reporting strange phenomena, and I needed to find out what had happened to my colleagues. The flight to Antarctica was long and tiring, and the cold enveloped me as soon as I stepped onto the icy continent. The helicopter pilot dropped me off near the station, a solitary, imposing structure in the middle of a white desert. The feeling of isolation was overwhelming. As I approached, I noticed that the station seemed intact, but there was a strange stillness in the air, as if the place itself was waiting for something. I entered the station and was greeted by an oppressive silence. The temperature inside was bearable thanks to the heaters, but I still felt a deep chill. I turned on the lights and began exploring the empty hallways. The walls were covered with climate charts and research notes, but there was no sign of life. The first few days were lonely and unsettling. With every step I took, I felt as if I was being watched. Small objects, like pens and papers, would inexplicably move around. At night, noises echoed through the hallways, indistinct whispers and footsteps that were not my own. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, but the sense of presence would not let me. I found the field journal of Lucas, the leader of the research team. His notes began normally, detailing weather conditions and scientific discoveries, but they soon became chaotic. He mentioned a haunting melody he heard at night, played by an ancient violin that should never have been found. The music seemed to have a hypnotic effect on him, leading him to explore dangerous areas of the station. I decided to follow the clues Lucas had left. In the storage room, among boxes of old equipment, I found the violin. It was dusty, but well preserved. When I played it, a soft, melancholy melody filled the air, making the station seem to vibrate with a dark energy. I felt a chill, but I couldn't stop playing. The following nights were even more unsettling. The violin would play by itself, and shadows would move across the walls as if something were trying to break free. I tried to contact the main base, but all attempts at communication failed. I was completely isolated. One night, the violin's melody became unbearably loud, and the temperature in the station plummeted. I heard whispers coming from the hallway and decided to investigate. The lights flickered, creating an atmosphere of growing terror. At the end of the hall, I saw a spectral figure, Lucas, or at least something that resembled him. His eyes were empty, and he was humming a violin melody. "You shouldn't be here, Anna," the figure said, his voice echoing like a lament. "They are awake, and you have awakened them." My mind swirled with fear and confusion. The shadows around the figure began to stir, taking on monstrous shapes. I remembered Lucas's notes about a ritual that must be performed to appease the ancient spirits that protected the violin. I hurried back to the lab, where I found more notes detailing the ritual. I was to play a specific melody on the violin during the coming storm, using ancient words of appeasement. I braced myself, knowing that this was my only chance of survival. The storm came with indescribable fury, the station shaking under the impact of the winds and snow. I positioned myself in the center of the laboratory and began to play the melody, reciting the ancient words. The shadows around me intensified, trying to distract me, but I kept my focus. Lucas's figure appeared again, watching silently as I fought against my fear. I felt that the evil entity was trying to break through the barrier of light created by the melody and the words. I continued, each note and word weakening the evil presence. At the climax of the ritual, a blinding light filled the station, dispelling the shadows and the spectral figure of Lucas. The violin sounded one last note before falling to the ground, shattering into pieces. The candlelight went out, leaving me in a deep, peaceful silence. I fell to my knees, exhausted but victorious. It felt like the entity had finally been calmed, and the station was free of its influence. The oppressive silence disappeared, replaced by a renewed tranquility. As I left the station, the light of dawn began to appear on the horizon. I knew I had managed to free the station from its darkness, but the feeling that something more terrible might still be coming never completely left me. I left Antarctica with a mixture of relief and concern. I knew that, although I had won this battle, the fight against evil is eternal. My journey as a climate scientist was far from over, and the promise to continue protecting the secrets of the past remained firm. And so, my story continues, with a promise to protect the legacy of the scientists who suffered on the station. The light may have prevailed this time, but the darkness never rests. The fight against evil is infinite, and as long as there is courage and determination, the light will always prevail. Back in civilization, I tried to resume my normal life, but the memories of Polaris Station never faded. Nightmares haunted my nights, and the feeling of being watched persisted. I received a call from Pedro, a scientist who had worked at the station before me. He was concerned about similar events occurring at another station, Borealis Station in the Arctic. I knew I needed to continue my journey. I accepted Pedro's invitation and prepared myself for the new expedition, aware that the secrets of the violin and the ancient spirits were not yet completely resolved. The real battle against the darkness was just beginning. Returning to civilization was difficult. The feeling of isolation and constant restlessness were difficult to shake. My apartment felt strange and empty, as if the shadows of Antarctica had followed me. However, I received a call from Pedro, an old friend and fellow scientist who had worked at the Polaris Station before me. He was deeply worried. "We have a serious problem, Anna. Strange things are happening at Borealis Station in the Arctic. Whispers, shadows, a feeling of oppression. We need you here." I knew I couldn't ignore this call. Borealis Station was my next mission, and I needed to solve the mysteries that had begun in Antarctica. I prepared myself for the journey, aware that the terror I had faced before could be just the beginning. Arriving at Borealis Station was like reliving a nightmare. The feeling of isolation and biting cold were familiar, but now they carried a greater weight. Pedro and his team greeted me with tense expressions, clearly affected by recent events. "It's happening again, Anna," said Pedro. "It all started after one of our scientists, Mark, found an ancient violin in a nearby ice cave. Since then, strange things have been happening. Shadows move alone, and we hear whispers in the night." My heart sank. Another violin. The connection between the two stations was clear, and the terror I had faced in Antarctica was far from over. We decided to investigate the ice cave where the violin had been found, hoping to find out more about the entity that seemed to be chasing us. The cave was a maze of ice, its walls glowing an ethereal blue. As we went deeper, the temperature dropped drastically, and the feeling of oppression increased. Finally, we found the chamber where the violin was kept. It was a surreal sight. The ancient instrument was trapped in the ice, emanating an ominous aura. "We need to perform the ritual again," said Pedro, his voice shaking. "But this time we need to do it completely and correctly." We spent the next few days studying the old notes and preparing for the ritual. During this time, demonstrations increased. Objects moved on their own, whispers filled the air, and shadows danced on the walls. The feeling of being watched never left me. On the night of the ritual, the atmosphere was charged with tension. We gathered in the cave, around the violin. We lit candles and began to recite the ancient words. Pedro played the melody on the violin while the other scientists and I sang the ritual. The shadows around us began to stir, and the evil presence became palpable. The temperature dropped drastically, and a spectral figure began to emerge from the ice. It was Mark, or at least a distorted and haunted version of him. "You shouldn't be here," whispered the figure, his voice echoing through the cave. "They are awake, and you have freed them." The figure advanced, bringing with it a sense of despair and pain. The shadows around him became more intense, pressing down on us from all sides. I remembered the ritual and continued reciting the words, each note and word weakening the evil presence. The violin emitted a loud, sharp melody, and the candlelight flickered violently. The shadows began to dissipate, and the spectral figure let out a final scream before disappearing completely. Light filled the cave, dispelling the darkness and bringing a sense of peace. We fell to our knees, exhausted but victorious. We knew we had managed to banish the entity once again, but the feeling that something more terrible might still be coming never completely left us. As we left the cave, the light of dawn began to appear on the horizon. We knew that the fight against evil was eternal, and our journey as guardians of the temples was just beginning. Each victory brought us closer to the truth, but also reminded us of the horrors that were yet to come. We left the Arctic with a mixture of relief and concern. We knew that although we had won this battle, the fight against evil is never ending. My journey as a climate scientist was far from over, and the promise to continue protecting the secrets of the past remained firm. And so, my story continues, with a promise to protect the legacy of the scientists who suffered in their name. The light may have prevailed this time, but the darkness never rests. The fight against evil is infinite, and as long as there is courage and determination, the light will always prevail. The feeling of victory was brief. Dawn brought momentary relief, but something wasn't right. As we walked back to the station, we noticed that the violin, which should have been destroyed, was intact and emanating a light melody that seemed to grow in intensity. What we thought was a triumph began to turn into an even bigger nightmare. Pedro stopped suddenly, his eyes wide with terror. "Do you hear that?" he whispered, voice shaking. We all hear it. The violin's soft, mesmerizing melody spread through the frigid air, growing in volume and complexity. Suddenly, the earth shook beneath our feet, and the ice cave behind us began to collapse, sealing the entrance. We were trapped in the Arctic, surrounded by a dead silence broken only by haunting music. The evil presence, which we thought we had defeated, seemed stronger than ever. "We need to get back to the station," I said, trying to remain calm. "Maybe there we can find out what's going on." We ran back to Borealis Station, but the feeling of oppression and fear only increased. When we arrived, we found the station in a state of chaos. The lights were flickering uncontrollably, and the equipment was all out of place. The violin melody echoed everywhere, increasing the feeling of terror. "We have to destroy him once and for all," said Luisa, her voice firm but her eyes full of terror. "But how?" It was then that I noticed something in Lucas's old notes. There was a mention of a final sacrifice, something that must be done to seal the entity once and for all. The only way to destroy the violin and lift the curse would be with a voluntary human sacrifice. "No," said Peter, reading the same passage. "We cannot do that. There must be another way." Time was running out. The shadows around us began to shake violently, and Mark's spectral figure reappeared, more terrifying than ever. "You can't escape," he growled, his voice echoing through the station. "They are awake and want revenge." Sensing the imminence of disaster, I made a decision that I knew was necessary. "I'll do it," I said, voice steady despite the fear. "I will sacrifice myself to save us all." Pedro and Luisa tried to dissuade me, but I knew it was the only way. I picked up the violin and headed to the center of the station, where the shadows were thickest. I started playing the melody, this time with a sense of purpose. The shadows advanced, but I continued playing, each note filling the station with intense light. "I'm sorry," I whispered, knowing this would be the end of me. But this has to end. At the climax of the tune, a blinding explosion of light swept through the station, dispelling the shadows and Mark's spectral figure. The violin sounded one last note before disintegrating in my hands. The feeling of oppression disappeared, replaced by a deep calm. I fell to the ground, feeling my strength abandon me. Pedro and Luisa ran to me, tears in their eyes. "You did it," said Pedro, his voice breaking. "You saved us all." As my vision darkened, I felt a peace I had never felt before. I knew that evil had finally been defeated. Borealis Station was free of the curse, and the world was a little safer. With my last breath, I whispered, "The light will always prevail." Borealis Station was abandoned shortly afterwards, becoming a memorial to those who sacrificed their lives to protect the world from dark forces. Pedro and Luisa returned to their lives, but they never forgot the horrors they faced and the sacrifice that was made. Stories about the violin and the ancient entity became legend, passed down from generation to generation as a warning about the power of evil and the courage needed to face it. And although the station was silent, the memory of the sacrifice would endure, reminding everyone that the fight against darkness is eternal, and that the light will always prevail as long as there is courage and determination. And so, the story ended. But the legacy of courage and sacrifice continued, a beacon of hope in the infinite darkness. In the heart of an isolated mountain, surrounded by dense forests and frequent snowfalls, there was an ancient hotel known as the Mountain Hotel. This hotel had a reputation for luxury and tranquility, but it also kept a dark secret. Ricardo, a writer in search of inspiration and isolation, decided to stay at the hotel, hoping to finish his next novel and overcome a creative block that had been plaguing him for months. I arrived at the Mountain Hotel at dusk, when the shadows of the forest were already long and dark. The hotel's imposing facade rose against the gray sky, promising comfort and refuge from the biting cold. The place had an air of elegant decay, like an aging lady who still bore traces of her former glory. My name is Ricardo and I am a writer. For the past few months, my work has been plagued by a writer's block that seemed unbreakable. Each attempt to write resulted in blank pages and mounting frustration. I decided I needed isolation, a place away from the distractions of the world, where I could find again the voice that seemed to have abandoned me. Upon entering the hotel, I was greeted by the manager, a tall, thin man with eyes that always seemed to be assessing. "Welcome to the Hotel da Montaña, Mr. Ricardo. I hope your stay is pleasant," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. The lobby was grand, with a roaring fireplace that cast dancing shadows on the carved wooden walls. My room was on the third floor with a stunning view of the snow-covered forest. Settled in my room, I began to unpack my bags, feeling a mix of relief and anxiety. I needed to find my inspiration again. On the first night, it was absolutely silent, except for the occasional crackle from the heater. However, I soon started to notice little things that were out of the ordinary. A book I had left on the nightstand was now on the floor. A cold draft blew through the room, even though all the windows were closed. On the second day, I explored more of the hotel. The hallways were long and dimly lit, decorated with portraits of former guests and owners. One of these portraits caught my attention. It belonged to an elegant man, with an intense gaze that seemed to follow me wherever I went. The manager, noticing my interest, approached me. "This is Mr. Antonio, one of the first owners of the hotel," he explained. "Rumor has it that he mysteriously disappeared one night and was never seen again." The story piqued my curiosity. I decided that night I would write about Antonio. But when I tried to focus, the writer's block came back with a vengeance. I closed my laptop in frustration, and that's when I heard it for the first time, a soft violin melody coming from downstairs. I followed the music into the living room, where an old violin sat on a chair playing by itself. My hairs stood on end, and as I approached to investigate, the music stopped abruptly. The violin was cool to the touch, but the feeling of being watched was intense. Over the next few nights, supernatural activity increased. Objects moved by themselves, doors closed with bangs, and the melody of the violin echoed through the corridors. With each event, I felt my sanity being tested. I decided to confront the manager. "Something is very wrong in this hotel," I told him. "There's something or someone here, and I need to know what's going on." The manager sighed, as if he had been waiting for this conversation. "The hotel has a dark history, Mr. Ricardo. They say that Mr. Antonio's spirit still wanders here, trapped by an unfinished melody. He used to play the violin every night, but the night he disappeared, something interrupted him. Since then, his presence has tormented guests." My determination grew. I needed to discover the truth and finish the melody. I spent the next few days researching the hotel archives, finding old letters and notes from Mr. Antonio. I discovered that he was obsessed with a composition that he believed had the power to reveal hidden secrets. Finally, I found the last piece of the melody, a yellowed and worn page hidden inside an old book. I decided that night I would play the full melody, hoping to free Antonio's spirit and bring peace to the hotel. In the evening, I sat in the living room with the violin. The atmosphere was charged, and the feeling of being watched was almost palpable. I started playing, each note echoing through the empty halls. The shadows on the walls began to move, and the spectral figure of Antonio appeared before me, his face a mask of anguish and hope. I continued playing, concentrating on the melody. The figure of Antonio approached, and when he reached the last note, a scream of relief and agony echoed through the hotel. The figure disappeared in an explosion of light, and the violin fell from my hands, breaking when it touched the floor. The silence that followed was absolute. The feeling of oppression and cold disappeared, and an unexpected peace took over the place. The manager entered the room, eyes wide with surprise and gratitude. "You did it," he said. "Antonio's spirit is finally at peace." Although the hotel was now free of the evil presence, I knew that my journey was far from over. The experience had changed me profoundly, and the creative block that had plagued me had disappeared. The words were flowing again, and my next novel was taking shape. I left the Hotel da Montana with a mixture of relief and curiosity. I knew that other dark stories and mysteries were waiting for me somewhere, ready to be discovered and revealed. The fight against the forces of darkness is never-ending, and I was more prepared than ever to face it. And so, my story continues, with a promise to protect the secrets of haunted places and those who suffered in their name. The light may have prevailed this time, but the darkness never rests. The fight against evil is infinite, and as long as there is courage and determination, the light will always prevail. As I returned to civilization, the feeling that something more terrible might be yet to come never quite left me. The fight against evil is eternal, and my journey as a writer and investigator was just beginning. The next story was waiting to be discovered, and I was ready to face it. Returning to the city, the sense of peace I felt upon leaving the mountain hotel was soon replaced by a lingering restlessness. Something inside me knew that my experience there had been just the beginning. The creative block that tormented me had disappeared, but the memory of Antonio's violin, melody, and spirit remained vivid in my mind. A few months passed, and my new romance began to take shape. However, my routine was interrupted by a letter that arrived with no return address. The envelope was old and yellowed, and inside was a small piece of paper with a handwritten message. "Hotel da Montana is not the only one Borealis station awaits." The memory of the conversation I had with Pedro about similar events at another station came back to me. I decided I needed to investigate. Borealis station, located in the Arctic, was known for its climate change studies, but it also had a history of mysterious disappearances and supernatural activity. My arrival at Borealis Station was marked by a cold reception, both literally and figuratively. The feeling of isolation was even more intense than on the mountain. Pedro received me with a worried look and a tense expression. "Ricardo, I'm glad you came. Strange things are happening here, and I fear something much darker is at play." The station was full of scientific equipment and labyrinthine corridors. On the first night, the atmosphere was already charged with tension. Objects moved on their own, and the temperature dropped drastically at certain times. I heard whispers and footsteps when I was alone, reminding me of the experiences at the hotel. Pedro showed me a diary belonging to Mark, one of the scientists who disappeared. His notes mentioned a haunting melody, similar to one I had found on the mountain, and spoke of an ancient violin discovered in a nearby ice cave. We decided to investigate the cave in hopes of finding answers. The cave was a maze of ice, its walls glowing an ethereal blue. As we went deeper, the temperature dropped even further, and the feeling of oppression increased. We found a chamber where the violin was stored, trapped in ice, emanating a sinister aura. "We need to perform the ritual again," said Pedro, his voice shaking. "But this time, we need to do it completely and correctly." We spent the next few days studying the old notes and preparing for the ritual. During this time, supernatural manifestations increased. Objects moved on their own, whispers echoed through the hallways, and shadows danced on the walls. The feeling of being watched never left me. On the night of the ritual, the atmosphere was charged with tension. We gathered in the cave around the violin. We lit candles and began to recite the ancient words. Pedro played the melody on the violin, while the other scientists and I sang the ritual. The shadows around us began to stir, and the evil presence became palpable. The temperature dropped dramatically, and a spectral figure began to emerge from the ice. It was Mark, or at least a distorted and haunted version of him. "You shouldn't be here," the figure whispered, his voice echoing through the cavern. "They are awake, and you have freed them." The figure advanced, bringing with it a sense of despair and pain. The shadows around it grew more intense. Pressing in on us from all sides, I remembered the ritual and continued to recite the words, each note and word weakening the evil presence. The violin emitted a high, shrill melody, and the candlelight flickered violently. The shadows began to dissipate, and the spectral figure let out a final scream before disappearing completely. Light filled the cavern, dispelling the darkness and bringing a sense of peace. We fell to our knees, exhausted but victorious. We knew we had succeeded in banishing the entity once more, but the feeling that something even more terrible might yet come never quite left us. As we left the cave, the light of dawn began to break on the horizon. We knew that the fight against evil was eternal, and our journey as temple guardians had only just begun. Each victory brought us closer to the truth, but also reminded us of the horrors yet to come. We left the Arctic with a mixture of relief and unease. We knew that although we had won this battle, the fight against evil was never ending. My journey as a climate scientist was far from over, and the promise to continue protecting the secrets of the past remained firm. And so my story continues, with the promise to protect the legacy of the scientists who suffered in its name. The light may have prevailed this time, but the darkness never rests. The fight against evil is endless, and as long as there is courage and determination, the light will always prevail. As I made my way back to civilization, the sense that something even more terrible might yet come never quite left me. The fight against evil is eternal, and my journey as a writer and researcher had only just begun. The next story was waiting to be discovered, and I was ready to face it. As we made our way back to civilization, the feeling that something was still watching us wouldn't leave me. Pedro and I exchanged few words, each lost in our own thoughts and reflections on the horrors we had faced. Back in the city, we tried to resume our normal lives. Pedro returned to his research, while I immersed myself in writing my new novel, which was now flowing like never before. However, the nights were difficult. Constant nightmares tormented me, and the haunting melody of the violin echoed in my dreams. A few weeks later, I received a mysterious letter, again with no return address. The envelope was identical to the one I had received before leaving for the Arctic. With a sense of apprehension, I opened it and read the message written in familiar handwriting. The battle may have been won, but the war is far from over. Prepare yourself. The message filled me with deep fear, but also with renewed determination. I knew that my fight against the forces of darkness had only just begun. The light I had found needed to be kept burning, no matter how dark the darkness that was approaching. That night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard a familiar sound. The melody of the violin, soft and mesmerizing, echoed through my apartment. I followed the sound to the living room, where I found the violin intact and emitting a ghostly light. Beside it, a familiar figure appeared, the spirit of Antonio, now more peaceful, but still with a look of urgency. "Ricardo," he said, "you have succeeded in freeing us, but there are others like us. You are the one chosen to continue this fight. Protect the secrets you have discovered and use your talent to reveal the hidden truths." With those words, Antonio's figure disappeared and the melody ceased. I picked up the violin, feeling a weight of responsibility on my shoulders. I knew that my mission was far from over. I needed to find and free other tormented spirits, protect ancient secrets, and combat the forces of darkness wherever they arose. The fight against evil was eternal, but I was prepared to face it. The Mountain Hotel, Borealis Station, and now my own home were only the first chapters in a long journey. The light may have prevailed temporarily, but the darkness never rests. And so, with violin in hand and renewed determination in my heart, I knew that my story was only beginning. The next battle awaited me, and I was ready to face it with courage and resilience, aware that the fight against evil never ends, but the light of truth always prevails. The journey continues, and I, Ricardo, remain firm in my purpose to protect the legacy of those who suffered and reveal the secrets of darkness, knowing that each victory brings with it new challenges and horrors to be faced. The story never ends, and the fight against evil is infinite. In the confines of a vast and dense tropical forest, there is a place avoided by everyone. Local legends speak of an ancient entity that fiercely protects the forest and its sacred plants. Julia, a dedicated biologist, ventured into this forest in search of rare medicinal plants that could contain a cure for a disease that affected her family. Her motivation was clear: to save lives and perhaps redeem her family's name, marred by past tragedies. When I reached the edge of the forest, the air was heavy and damp, thick with the smell of decaying vegetation. The silence was profound, broken only by the distant sound of animals and the rustling of leaves. The nearest village was miles away, and the feeling of isolation was almost palpable. My name is Julia, and I am a biologist on a desperate mission. I need to find a cure for a rare disease that has devastated my family. This forest, with its rare plants and ancient secrets, may be my only hope. I entered the forest at dawn, following a narrow, ill-defined path. The tree canopy blocked most of the sunlight, creating a dark and oppressive environment. Every step I took seemed to be watched by invisible eyes, and the feeling of being watched grew every moment. The villagers warned me about the entity that protects the forest, but I was determined to continue. As I progressed, I began to notice signs that I was not alone. Strange footprints in the ground, trees marked with incomprehensible symbols, and most disturbing of all, a soft, mesmerizing melody that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. My curiosity and scientific instinct led me to follow the melody despite my growing fear. As night fell, I set up camp in a small clearing. The feeling of oppression was intense, and the air felt colder than it should have been. The violin melody was clearer now, piercing the darkness in my thoughts. I tried to focus on my field diary, writing down my observations, but the music wouldn't leave me alone. During the night, I was awakened by a loud, booming sound. I opened my eyes and saw that my tent was shaking, as if someone or something was trying to get in. I grabbed my flashlight and went out, ready to face whatever it was. The clearing was deserted, but the shadows danced strangely, as if they had a life of their own. I felt a chill run down my spine, and the violin melody intensified, filling the air with a sense of desperation and urgency. I continued my journey the next day, following the melody that now seemed to guide my steps. I found an old cabin hidden among the trees, covered in moss and almost swallowed by vegetation. The melody seemed to come from inside her. I entered cautiously, and the air was heavy with the smell of mustiness and decay. Inside the cabin, I found an old diary, covered in dust. The pages were filled with notes about ancient rituals and sacred plants, but what caught my attention most was the mention of an enchanted violin, said to be the key to controlling the forest entity. As I read, I felt a presence behind me and quickly turned around, only to see a fleeting shadow disappearing into the darkness. I decided I needed to find this violin and understand its connection to the entity. The following nights were full of disturbing events, objects that moved on their own, whispers in the wind, and shadows that seemed to move on their own. With each step, the feeling of being watched increased, and the weight of the forest seemed crushing. Finally, after days of searching, I found a cave hidden between gigantic roots. The entrance was narrow and dark, and the violin melody was almost deafening inside. With my heart racing, I entered the cave, feeling the cold, damp air against my skin. The walls of the cave were covered in ancient symbols, and in the center was a stone pedestal with an ancient, dusty violin. As I approached the violin, a spectral figure appeared. It was a woman, with empty eyes and an expression of deep sadness. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice echoing through the cave. "The entity does not forgive intruders." Fear paralyzed me for a moment, but my determination was stronger. "I'm here to save my family," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "I need to understand how to control the entity." The figure looked at me with a mixture of compassion and sadness. "The entity is ancient and powerful. It was created to protect the forest and its sacred plants. Only through the music of this violin can she be controlled, but the price is high." I picked up the violin, feeling an icy cold rise up my arm. "I'm willing to pay the price," I said, playing the first note. The melody filled the cave, and the spectral figure disappeared, replaced by a feeling of overwhelming oppression. I continued playing, each note filling the air with a sense of urgency and desperation. The shadows around me began to stir, and a dark, imposing figure emerged from the darkness. It was the entity of the forest, with glowing eyes and a terrifying presence. "You dare challenge me?" the entity roared, voice reverberating through the cave. "I'm not here to challenge," I replied, trying to remain calm. "I'm here to understand and to save." The entity advanced, and the temperature in the cave dropped drastically. I continued playing, each note seeming to weaken the entity. Finally, the entity let out a deafening scream and dissipated into a cloud of shadows. I fell to my knees, exhausted but victorious. The violin was in my hands and the cave was silent. I knew I had managed to banish the entity for now, but the feeling that something more terrible was yet to come never completely left me. As I left the cave and the forest, I felt a mixture of relief and uneasiness. I knew my journey was far from over. The fight against the forces of darkness is never ending, and I was more prepared than ever to face it. And so my story continues, with a promise to protect the legacy of sacred plants and the spirits who suffer in their name. The light may have prevailed this time, but the darkness never rests. The fight against evil is infinite, and as long as there is courage and determination, the light will always prevail. The dark forest held many secrets, and I was ready to uncover them, knowing that each discovery brought new challenges and horrors to be faced. The story never ends, and the fight against evil is eternal. As I left the cave, the feeling of relief mixed with a new uneasiness. I knew that the entity had been temporarily banished, but the forest held many other secrets and dangers. The violin was safe in my backpack, a constant reminder of what I had faced and what was yet to come. The path back to the clearing where I had set up camp seemed longer and more winding. Night was quickly approaching, and the shadows of the trees seemed more menacing than before. The silence of the forest was oppressive, and the only company I had were my own thoughts and the violin, whose presence I constantly felt when I finally reached the clearing. I set up my tent again and built a fire. The heat of the flames brought some comfort, but the feeling of being watched never completely went away. I took out my diary and started writing down everything I had discovered, trying to organize my thoughts. Suddenly, I heard a soft, distant sound. It was the violin melody, but this time it wasn't coming from the cave. I stood up quickly, trying to locate the source of the sound. The melody seemed to move around the clearing, as if it were surrounding me. My heart started to beat faster, and the feeling of imminent danger intensified. I took the violin from my backpack, determined to face him again. I started playing the melody, trying to replicate the notes I had learned in the cave. The shadows around the clearing began to stir, and a spectral figure appeared among the trees. It was the same woman I had seen in the cave. She approached slowly, her expression full of sadness and urgency. "You must continue," she whispered, voice echoing across the clearing. "The entity is not the only threat. There are more dangers hidden in the forest, and you are the only one who can stop them." Before I could respond, the figure disappeared. Leaving me alone in the clearing with the violin in my hands, I knew my journey was far from over. There were more secrets to discover, more entities to face, and more lives to save. I spent the night on alert, sleeping only in short intervals and waking up at any strange sound. At dawn, I decided to explore deeper into the forest, determined to discover what else was hidden among the ancient and mysterious trees. As I walked, I found signs that I was not alone. Strange footprints in the ground, symbols carved into trees, and a constant feeling of being watched. The forest felt alive, and every step I took seemed to be guided by an invisible force. I arrived at a small lake surrounded by tall, dark trees. The water was a deep blue, almost black, and the surface was strangely calm. I felt a strong presence there, something that seemed to be waiting for me. Suddenly, the water in the lake began to stir and a figure slowly emerged. It was a different entity, more powerful and threatening than the previous one. Her eyes shone with a cold, piercing light, and her presence made the air around me turn cold. "Do you dare defy the guardians of the forest?" the entity roared, its voice reverberating through the room. "You don't understand the powers you are dealing with." I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the violin in my hands. "I'm here to protect and understand," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "I do not seek confrontation, but I will not allow evil to prevail." The entity advanced, and the feeling of oppression became almost unbearable. I began to play the violin, each note filling the air with a melody that seemed to weaken the entity. The shadows around me shook violently, and the lake began to bubble. The fight was intense and exhausting, but finally, with a deafening scream, the entity dissipated in a cloud of darkness. The lake became calm again, and the feeling of immediate danger disappeared. I knew I had achieved another victory, but I also knew that the forest held many other secrets and threats. My mission was far from complete, and the path ahead would be full of challenges and dangers. As I left the lake and continued my journey through the dark forest, I felt a new determination grow within me. She was ready to face whatever came next, protecting ancient secrets and facing the forces of darkness with courage and resilience. My story was far from over, and the fight against evil was eternal. But as long as I had the violin and the determination to keep going, I knew I could make a difference. The light may have prevailed this time, but the darkness never rests. The fight continues, and I'm ready to face it. As I made my way through the forest, I knew that each step took me closer to the truth and the next challenge. The violin in my hands was both a weapon and a reminder of what was at stake. The dark forest held many secrets, and I was determined to uncover them, knowing that each discovery brought new challenges and horrors to be faced. The story never ends, and the fight against evil is eternal. As I advanced through the forest, a feeling of growing oppression came over me. The trees around me seemed to close in, their shadows dancing with a life of their own. The violin melody still echoed in my mind, a constant reminder of the danger I faced. Dusk was approaching, casting a ghostly light over the landscape. The forest seemed to come to life, every sound amplified by my growing paranoia. I heard whispers coming from all directions, indistinguishable words that turned into a chorus of terror. As I continued forward, I came across a clearing that looked different from all the others. In the center was a circle of ancient stones, covered in moss and runic markings. The air was freezing, and the feeling of being watched was almost unbearable. In the middle of the circle, there was a stone pedestal with an old book and a violin, similar to the one I was carrying. Approaching cautiously, I opened the book, which was full of forgotten rituals and incantations. The evil presence was palpable, and suddenly a colossal shadow emerged from the trees, its eyes shining with a cold, deadly light. "You dare desecrate this sacred place?" the entity roared, its voice reverberating through the clearing. It was a dark and imposing figure, an amalgamation of all the darkness I had felt in the forest. I picked up the violin and began to play the melody I had learned, each note filling the air with a sense of urgency and desperation. The entity advanced, and the temperature around me dropped drastically. The shadows stirred, forming hands and faces that tried to grab me. The fight that followed was intense and terrifying. The entity lunged at me, each attack increasing my sense of despair. I kept playing, my hands shaking, trying to stay focused. The melody seemed to weaken the entity, but it also drained my strength. Suddenly, the spectral figure of the woman I had seen before appeared beside me, her expression full of determination. "You must complete the ritual," she whispered. "Only then will the entity be banned." Following his instructions, I changed the melody, incorporating the notes that were in the book. The atmosphere around me changed, and the clearing was filled with a bright, cleansing light. The entity roared in anger and pain, its form beginning to disintegrate. With one last effort, I played the final note. The entity let out a deafening scream and dissipated in an explosion of light and shadows. The clearing fell silent, the oppression and cold replaced by a feeling of peace. I fell to my knees, exhausted but triumphant. The woman's spectral figure smiled at me before disappearing, and the clearing returned to its natural state. I knew I had banished the entity, but the feeling that something more terrible was yet to come never completely left me. I stood up slowly, the violin still in my hands. The surrounding forest seemed calmer, but I knew my journey was far from over. The fight against the forces of darkness is never ending, and I was more prepared than ever to face it. As I left the clearing, I heard a soft, distant sound, a new melody that seemed to come from the depths of the forest. I knew it was a calling, a warning that the darkness never rests.